The night smoke rose from the ridge above Black Hollow. Men stepped out of the trading post and stared as if the mountain itself had begun to breathe. Nobody was supposed to be alive up there. Not in January. Not after the wind turned cruel. And certainly not Eliza Mercer. By Christmas, most of the town had already decided what winter would do to her. They had been wrong. Back in October, before the snow sealed the high ground and before the creek edges turned hard as iron, the Mercer place had already begun to rot from the inside. It started with the livestock. A milk cow went down first. Then a horse turned lame so badly Gideon Mercer had to put it down before sundown. A few days later, 2 more animals weakened in the feedlot, their hides dull, their legs trembling, their breath shallow in the cold morning air. Loss like that could break a homestead. And on the frontier, when fear enters a house, blame usually enters right behind it. Ruth Mercer understood that well. She had been Eliza's stepmother less than 3 years, but that had been long enough for the whole settlement to notice what lived behind her polite voice. She never shouted, never raged. She only placed suspicion carefully, like kindling laid under dry wood. Maybe the feed had been touched. Maybe somebody in the household had reason to be bitter. Maybe bad feeling had a way of reaching the animals before anyone else. She never had to force the accusation. Black Hollow carried it for her. Soon, conversations quieted when Eliza entered a room. At church, the space beside her stayed empty. At the trading post, men who had known her since childhood suddenly found the floorboards more interesting than her face. It was not the gossip that hurt her most. It was her father. Gideon Mercer was not a hard man. He was worse in a season like that. He was soft in the wrong places. He heard what people were saying and answered it with silence. He saw the way Ruth worked on the house, on the table, on his daughter's place in it, and said nothing. He never called Eliza innocent, never told her to stay, never once stood between her and the cold shape things were taking. And little by little, the Mercer home stopped behaving like a home. There was less food set out. Her blankets were left damp after a roof leak no one hurried to mend. When she tried to patch things herself, Ruth accused her of waste. Every small cruelty was deniable on its own. Together, they made staying impossible. By the last week of October, the wind coming down from the high country had changed its sound. It no longer whispered through the cottonwoods. It warned. That was the evening Ruth said perhaps Eliza ought to go elsewhere for a while. Not forever. Only until tempers settled. Only until the talk died down. Gideon sat near the fire and stared into it like a man hoping flames might speak in his place. Then he said the one thing a frightened man always says when he is about to fail someone who depends on him. Maybe that would be best. Eliza did not argue. By dawn she had gathered what she could carry. A wool dress fit for work, a shawl, 1 blanket, a near-empty tinder tin, and a small iron key that had belonged to her mother. That was all. Nobody saddled a horse for her. Nobody asked where she meant to go. Her father stood in the yard while frost cracked under her boots, and for one foolish second she thought he might still call her back. He did not. So, Eliza turned north and walked toward the limestone ridge above Black Hollow. She had explored there as a child in warmer weather, and remembered a shallow cut in the rock above a narrow game trail. It was not a real cave, more a hollow in the stone, deep enough to cast shade, deep enough to turn away part of the weather. Not good shelter. Only the kind desperate people learned to call possible. By the time she reached it, the sky had gone flat and pale. Wind hissed through the dry grass around her boots. The stone opening looked even worse than she remembered. Broad at the mouth, damp at the back, the floor uneven and cold enough to feel unfriendly before she ever stepped inside. Still, the overhang reached far enough to break some of the wind. That was enough for a first night. It had to be. Eliza spent the last of the light dragging in brittle grass and fallen brush. Her fingers stiffened. Her shoulders burned. When darkness finally came, she struck sparks into the tinder and built a small fire from twigs and splinters. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. Then the wind changed. It slipped low across the floor, found the coals, and took the heat out of them so quickly it felt personal. Before midnight, the fire was dead. The cold that followed did not feel like ordinary cold. It came up through the ground, off the walls, through her dress, through the blanket, through bone. Eliza curled against the driest patch of stone and did not sleep. Outside, the ridge groaned now and then with the sound of branches shifting in the dark. Something moved once in the grass below, slow and careful. She sat there shivering, her jaw tight, her hands buried under her arms, and forced herself to think. Not about Ruth, not about the town, not even about her father. About heat. How quickly it fled. How the ground stole it. How the stone held cold like a grudge. How every wandering current of air turned shelter into a trap. That was when she understood the true shape of the problem. The cave was too large, too open, too hungry for warmth. If she wanted to live through winter, she did not need a bigger fire first. She needed a smaller room. A tighter space inside the stone. A place low enough, dry enough, still enough to hold heat, instead of surrendering it to the dark. By dawn, Eliza Mercer had not slept at all. But she had stopped thinking like someone who had been cast out. She was thinking like someone who had found the one question winter asks every living thing, and meant to answer it before night came again. Morning on the ridge came thin and colorless. Eliza stepped out of the stone hollow with aching legs, smoke grit still in her throat, and the clear understanding that one more night like the last would finish her. The fire had not failed because she was careless. It had failed because the wind had too much room to move. That thought stayed with her all morning. A shelter did not have to be large to keep a body alive. It had to be tight, still, mean enough to hold warmth and refuse the cold a way in. So instead of wandering lower in search of pity, Eliza went looking for material. By midday she found it. 3 miles north of the ridge, beyond a stand of scrub pine and a split-rail fence half buried in weeds, sat the remains of an abandoned claim. The cabin roof had sagged in. One wall of the barn leaned crooked, but inside, under dry shadow and old dust, there was hay. Not fresh hay. Not sweet hay. Old, yellowed, brittle stuff that crackled in her hands. To anyone else, it might have looked like waste. To Eliza, it looked like walls. She bundled the first armful in her shawl and carried it back across the ridge herself. By the second trip, the load had rubbed her collarbone raw. By the third, her palms were burning. The hay scratched her face, filled her sleeves, clung to her skirt, and left a trail behind her like she was shedding summer across the stones. Once, near the lower trail, 2 men from town saw her climbing with the bundle on her back. One of them laughed. "Look at that," he called. "Girl's fixing to stable herself." The other grinned and said, "Reckon she'll make a fine nest for the coyotes." Eliza kept walking. Not because the words did not strike her. They did. But winter had already begun separating useful things from useless ones, and she had no strength left to spend on either man. By sunset, she had stacked 6 ragged bundles inside the stone cut. It was not enough. Not nearly. Still, when she pressed her hand into the dry hay and felt how it trapped a pocket of warmth from her own skin, she knew she was closer than she had been the night before. The next day, she went back for more. And the day after that. Soon the climb itself became a rhythm of pain. Down the ridge, across the frozen grass, into the broken barn. Lift, wrap, carry, climb, drop, turn back again. The skin at the base of her fingers split open. Her shoulders bruised dark beneath the wool. Her breath steamed in harsh little bursts as the weather sharpened around her. On the fourth day, with sleet beginning to snap against the stone, Eliza nearly slipped on the upper trail and went to one knee so hard she saw white. She stayed there a moment, one arm over the hay bundle, breathing through clenched teeth. That was how Silas Boone found her. He was old in the way mountain men sometimes are, dried down by wind and distance until they looked carved rather than born. His beard was iron gray. His coat smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and trapped fur. He sat his mule a few yards off and looked at the bundle, then at the cave above her. "You hauling bedding?" he asked. "Or building something?" Eliza pushed herself upright. "Building," she said. Silas studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, as if that answered more than the word itself. "Good," he said. "Bedding won't save you up here." That was all. No pity, no sermon, no warning to go back where she had come from. He swung down from the mule, took the hay bundle as if it weighed nothing, and carried it the rest of the way to the stone cut. Inside, he stood turning slowly, taking in the damp walls, the crack in the rock, the dead fire, the stacked hay. Then he said, "Your fire's fighting the whole cave. Shrink the room, and you might stand a chance." Eliza looked at him sharply. "That's what I was thinking." Silas gave the smallest hint of a smile. "Then you're thinking right." He returned the next afternoon with things he could spare, and things he had decided she needed whether she asked or not. A hatchet with a chipped handle, a coil of rope, 2 short boards, a sack of nails gone rust-brown at the tips, and an old canvas grain sheet with more patches than cloth. "Not charity," he said, setting them down. "Call it investment. I'd like to see if your idea works." That mattered more than comfort would have. He was not rescuing her. He was taking her seriously. Together they began the first true shape of the shelter. Eliza cut forked sticks and drove them into the dirt floor in a shallow curve near the back of the stone hollow. The board spanned part of the frame. Brush went across that. Canvas over brush. Hay packed thick between the rough supports and the stone itself. Not one wall. 2. The cold rock outside. The hay-packed barrier inside. A room within the room. By dusk, her shoulders were shaking from effort, but the space had changed. The rear corner of the cave no longer felt open and hungry. It felt smaller, closer, like something that might one day hold warmth, instead of merely witnessing it die. Late on the third evening of the work, another man appeared at the mouth of the cave. Younger than Silas. Broad-shouldered, quiet-eyed. Owen Hale. He was a carpenter from the settlement, known more for steady hands than loose talk, and he stood there a long moment while the wind moved around him, and the last light touched the ridge. "They said you gone half wild," he said at last. Eliza kept stuffing hay into the inner wall. "They've said worse." Owen stepped inside, pressed his palm to the packed layer, then glanced toward the shrunken sleeping space at the back. A faint change came over his face. Not mockery. Recognition. "You're trying to stop the cave from breathing," he said. Eliza looked up. Yes. He nodded once, the way Silas had. That might actually work. For the first time since leaving home, somebody in Black Hollow had looked at what she was doing and seen a mind behind it. Outside, the wind rose with a long, low moan over the ridge. Inside, surrounded by dry hay, rough timber, canvas, and failing light, Eliza turned back to the half-built shelter and understood she was no longer only surviving the town's cruelty. She was building an answer to it. By the second week of November, the ridge no longer looked like autumn pretending to be winter. It looked like winter had arrived early and meant to stay. Snow clung in the shaded places all day. The ground rang hard beneath a boot heel. The wind came sharper now, not as a warning but as a fact, and every morning Eliza woke with the same thought before she even opened her eyes. Make it tighter. Make it warmer. make it hold. The shelter was changing by inches. That was the way real survival often happened on the frontier. Not all at once. Not in grand miracles. In small, stubborn corrections made before the cold could punish a mistake twice. Eliza and Silas cut more brush for the frame and packed more hay between the inner wall and the stone. Owen reshaped the entrance with scavenged boards, so the opening sat narrower and lower, enough to blunt the worst of the wind without sealing the air entirely. Eliza stitched strips of old cloth into the patched grain canvas and hung it where drafts slipped through unseen. Every fix taught her something. Cold fell, smoke wandered, loose spaces killed. So she lowered the sleeping place, banked the edges with more hay, and learned that warmth stayed where the air stayed still. The first night the shelter truly changed. She felt it before she trusted it. The fire was small that evening, no bigger than it needed to be. Just a careful bed of coals tucked near the stone vent they had been trying to tame for days. On earlier nights the smoke had curled back in, burning her eyes and throat until the whole place turned bitter and unlivable. But this time the draft found its path. The smoke climbed. Not cleanly, not perfectly. Still, it climbed, and the heat did something new. It did not vanish at once. It stayed low, gathered in the smaller chamber, caught in the packed hay and canvas and the close dark of the sleeping nook Eliza had carved out with labor and guesswork and the kind of patience desperation teaches fast. She sat very still, one hand held in front of her, testing the air. For the first time since she had left her father's house, her fingers stopped hurting before the fire died. That frightened her more than the cold had, because hope, after a season of humiliation, arrives like something almost dangerous. She slept that night in short, shallow stretches, waking again and again to check the coals, to touch the wall, to make certain the warmth had not been imagined. By dawn, the frost on the inside stone had thinned. That was proof enough to keep going. Below the ridge, Black Hollow was beginning to suffer in quieter ways. Cabins built in better months showed their flaws in winter. Wind found the gaps between logs. Doors rattled on bad hinges. Families burned through wood faster than they had planned, and every evening the smoke over town rose heavier, as if the whole settlement were trying to fight the same enemy with the same failing weapon. Children started coughing near the fire and still could not get fully warm. At the trading post, men spoke less about harvest and more about how long the cold might hold. And now, mixed in with the old talk about Eliza Mercer, a new rumor moved through Black Hollow. They said the girl on the ridge was still alive. They said she had lined a hole in the rock with hay like some creature making a burrow. They said old Silas Boone had been seen hauling lumber up the trail. Ruth Mercer laughed when she heard it. "She's making herself a grave with walls," she told anyone willing to listen. But Ruth had begun listening too. Because mockery sounds different when the thing being mocked refuses to die. Owen kept coming up to the ridge when work in town allowed it. He brought scraps no one else would have bothered saving. Short boards, bent nails straightened by hand, a broken latch that could still be made useful. He did not crowd Eliza with questions. He worked beside her the way practical men do when they respect what another pair of hands is trying to accomplish. One evening, as he was fitting the latch to the low entrance board, he paused and glanced toward the sleeping nook. "You built it lower on purpose," he said. "Elbow height," Eliza answered. "Maybe a little less. So the heat stays down where you are." She nodded. Owen looked around slowly, eyes moving over the packed hay, the hanging cloth, the low roof line over the sleeping space. Then he gave a quiet breath through his nose. "Town still laughing," he said. Eliza fed one stick into the coals. "Town laughs from inside drafty cabins." That almost pulled a smile from him. Almost. Then came the first true test. A hard blue day gave way to a worse night, the kind that settles over the plains and ridges with no softness in it at all. Even before dark, the wind had dropped low and mean. Silas, standing at the cave mouth with his collar turned up, looked west once and said only, "This one bites." After sunset the temperature fell fast. Every sound sharpened. Timber cracked out on the ridge. Snow hissed over stone. The stars looked close enough to cut on. Eliza sealed the entrance board, dropped the canvas, checked the vent, then crouched in the shelter with the smallest fire she dared trust. Too much flame would waste wood. Too little would surrender the night. Every choice felt exacting now. Outside, winter pressed against the cave in long, invisible hands. Inside, the smaller chamber held. Not warm in the way of a parlor or a proper home, but livable. Livable was a miracle. Eliza sat wrapped in her blanket, watching her own breath turn faint in the dim glow instead of boiling white in front of her face as it had before. She pressed her palm to the inner wall. Cold beyond, warmth within. Not much. Enough. By midnight she understood the truth of it. The shelter worked. Not beautifully, not comfortably, but honestly. It worked. Works in winter. Word of it travels faster than kindness ever does. Just before dawn, a shape appeared through the blowing dark outside the entrance. Then another. Owen's voice came through the wind, low and urgent. "Eliza." She lifted the board, and the cold struck in at once. Owen stood there with snow gathered on his shoulders and hat brim, his face tight in the gray half-light. Behind him was Silas, and between them, wrapped in quilts, was a small child whose coughing had gone weak with exhaustion. Owen looked at her and said the words Black Hollow had not imagined it would ever need to say. "We need your warm room." For half a second, Eliza did not move. The wind drove snow past Owen's shoulders and into the cave mouth in thin white streaks. The child between them was no more than 6 or 7, wrapped so tightly in quilts he looked small even for that age. What little face showed above the fabric had gone pale and waxy, the lips dark at the edges. Silas did not waste words. "Boy's been cold too long," he said. "Fire at their cabin won't hold." That was all Eliza needed. "Bring him in." They ducked through the low opening one by one, pulling the board shut fast behind them. At once the cave changed. More bodies meant more warmth, but also less air, less room, more pressure on everything Eliza had built with guesswork and grit. Owen knelt in the sleeping nook and eased the child down onto the blanket bed. The boy's mother came in after him, one hand against the wall to steady herself, her eyes wide with the stunned look of someone who had spent too many hours afraid. Eliza recognized her. Mrs. Harrow, one of the women who had once turned away at church. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Harrow looked around the close little chamber lined with hay, canvas, shadow, and firelight, and whatever pride she had carried up the ridge with her broke apart. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. Eliza put another short stick on the coals. "No," she said quietly. "You didn't." Outside, the blizzard tightened. The storm had come down off the high country like a door slamming shut. By full dark, Black Hollow had vanished beneath it. Fences disappeared first, then the road, then the shape of the settlement itself, until every cabin stood alone inside a spinning white world that seemed determined to erase the valley one structure at a time. On the ridge, the wind struck the limestone in long, hollow blows. Each time it hit, the entrance board shuddered. The child coughed once, then again, a dry tearing sound too small for the violence of it. Eliza crouched beside him and laid the back of her hand against his forehead. Too cold. Not fever cold. Core deep cold. The kind that quiets people before it kills them. "Get his boots off," she said. Mrs. Harrow fumbled at the laces with stiff fingers. Owen helped without a word. Silas fed the fire with maddening care, adding only what the draft could carry, no more. Too much smoke and they would choke themselves. Too little heat and the boy would sink lower. Eliza stripped off her own outer shawl and folded it over the child's chest. Mrs. Harrow looked at her as if the gesture hurt. "You don't have to." "Yes," Eliza said, still calm. "I do. Because winter did not care who had been cruel in October. It only counted who was breathing tonight." An hour later, another pounding came at the entrance. Then another. Silas turned his head sharply. Owen was already moving. When they lifted the board, wind burst inside in a wild swirl of ice crystals and black night. The second family stumbled through, half bent against the storm. A man with blood on one knuckle where the latch of his own cabin door had torn skin from it. His wife carrying a bundled infant under her coat. A girl of 10 or so with a blanket tied over her head and snow packed around her ankles. The cave had never been meant for this many. Eliza knew at the instant the board dropped shut again. The air changed. The space shrank. The fire seemed smaller. Too many frightened breaths. Too much damp wool. Too much snow melting off boots and hems. The infant started crying at once, thin and frantic. "Quiet now," the mother whispered, though her own voice was shaking. Owen looked at Eliza. It was not panic in his face. It was trust. He was waiting to see what she would do. Eliza forced herself to listen. Not to the crying. Not to the wind. To the room. Smoke still climbing. Heat still holding low. Moisture rising too fast. "If they stay standing, we lose the warm air," she said. No one argued. She set them to work immediately, because fear turns worse when hands have nothing to do. Boots off. Wet things near the outer wall. Children to the back. Keep your heads low when the board opens. No one touches the vent stones. Her voice was steady enough that people obeyed it before they had time to measure whether they liked taking orders from her. Silas shifted hay bundles to block a low draft creeping under one edge of the frame. Owen wedged an extra scrap board across the entrance seam. Eliza tore strips from an old feed sack and stuffed them into two narrow cracks where the wind had begun to whistle. The room held. Barely. Then, near midnight, the smoke changed. At first it was only a hesitation. A slow curl instead of a rise. Then the draft failed altogether, and a ribbon of gray rolled back into the shelter. Mrs. Harrow started coughing. The infant wailed. Someone near the entrance said, "God help us." Eliza was already moving. The storm outside had shifted. She could hear it now, no longer striking across the cave mouth the way it had before, but angling down from above. Somewhere up the crack in the limestone, snow had drifted across the vent line and strangled the draw. If the smoke stayed low, they would all be breathing poison before dawn. "I have to clear it," she said. Owen looked at the entrance board, then back at her. "In that. There isn't another way." Before anyone could stop her, Eliza wrapped cloth over her mouth, pulled her shawl tight, and lifted the board. The blizzard hit like a living thing. Cold slammed into her face so hard her eyes watered instantly. Snow tore sideways across the ridge. The world beyond the cave was not a world anymore. Only whiteness, wind, and the vague black shape of stone underfoot. She kept one hand on the wall, and moved along the outer face of the limestone toward the narrow place where the crack reached the surface. Twice the gusts nearly twisted her sideways. Once her boots slid and sent loose snow skating into the dark below. Then she found it. A drift packed hard over the vent opening, crusted by wind. Eliza dropped to one knee and clawed at it with both hands. Snow forced into her sleeves. Ice burned her fingers. The wind tried to peel her backward off the ridge. She dug anyway. One armful, then another, then another. At first nothing happened. Then from somewhere below came a low hungry pull. The cave had begun breathing again. Eliza tore the last packed layer free just as a gust struck her broadside. The ridge vanished under her feet for one sickening instant and she slammed shoulder first into the rock, barely catching herself before the dark fell away beneath her. For a moment she stayed there, forehead against stone, dragging air into lungs that felt half frozen. Then she turned and fought her way back. When Owen dragged the board open and hauled her inside, the warmth hit her face like a memory from another life. The smoke was climbing clean again. No one spoke. They only looked at her. The girl they had mocked, the girl they had cast out, the girl now standing in the firelight with snow in her hair, and blood on 2 fingers where the ice had split the skin. Mrs. Harrow's boy had stopped coughing. He was asleep. Not dying. Sleeping. And in the stillness that followed, while the storm battered the ridge and the little shelter held against it by hay, wood, stone, and one woman's refusal to yield, the truth finally settled over the room. Eliza Mercer had built the warmest place in Black Hollow. By dawn, when the worst of the blizzard began to loosen its grip, word was already waiting below the ridge. The girl in the cave had kept them alive. And now the town was coming. By morning, the storm had not truly ended. It had only exhausted itself. Black Hollow emerged by pieces, a fence post here, a rooftop there, the church steeple blurred behind veils of blowing white. Men came up the ridge in 2s and 3s, their boots punching deep into drifted snow, their faces raw from the cold and from something harder to bear. Shame. They stopped outside the cave first, uncertain suddenly, as if crossing that threshold required more courage than climbing the ridge in a blizzard ever had. Owen stepped out to meet them. "You keep the line moving," he said. "No crowding the entrance. Children first, old folks next. Wet things stay by the outer wall." And just like that, the shelter Eliza had built for one became a refuge for many. Not all at once. Not foolishly. In careful turns. A grandmother with blue, stiff fingers was brought up before noon and sat by the coals until feeling came back to her hands in painful little sparks. A young mother spent half the afternoon inside with a feverish baby pressed to her breast. 2 boys who had slept in a wagon shed because their father's cabin leaked wind through every seam came up after dark and left the next morning looking years younger than they had arrived. Eliza did not hover over them, did not ask whether they had once avoided her in town, did not make them pay for warmth with apology. She simply showed them what mattered. How the packed hay held still air. How the lower sleeping nook trapped what little heat a modest fire could give. How a draft too high was a nuisance, but a draft too low could kill. How a room inside a room could save wood, save fingers, save lungs, save lives. Men who had laughed now listened with their hats in their hands. Women who had once turned away at church went back down the ridge and began lining cabin walls with hay sacks, old cloth, brush, and anything else that could deaden the breath of winter. Owen and Silas helped where they could, moving from house to house, copying in timber and canvas the same principle Eliza had built first in stone. By the end of February, Black Hollow no longer fought the cold blindly. It fought smarter. And it survived. When the weather finally began to soften in March, the snow did not vanish at once. It sagged, darkened, pulled away from the south sides of buildings. The creek muttered under its lid of ice, and the valley gave off that strange smell of thawing earth, old smoke, and exhausted relief. That was when Mayor Voss called the town together. The meeting was held in the church because it was the only place large enough, though a good number of people had to stand along the walls. Eliza did not want to go at first. She had not built the shelter to be looked at. But Silas told her a hard truth in his usual way. "Folks ought to speak plain after a winter like this," he said. "Else they go right back to lying." So she went. The room quieted when she entered. No one moved away from her bench this time. Mayor Voss stood at the front with his gloves folded in both hands. He was not a grand speaker, which served the moment well. Grand words would only have made everything smaller. He spoke of the storm, of the children who had lived, of the old and frail who had passed the worst nights of winter in warmth because one young woman had seen a thing nobody else had seen. Then he spoke, carefully and without looking away, of the uglier truth. That Black Hollow had wronged Eliza Mercer.
That gossip had been welcomed where truth should have been demanded. That silence had done almost as much harm as cruelty. No one argued with him. How could they? Half the town was alive by the logic of her hands. By unanimous vote, they granted Eliza a tract of land on the ridge above the settlement and full use of timber, hay, and labor to build a proper winter house there before the next cold season. Not as charity, not as pity, as respect earned the hard way. When the vote was done, people came to her one by one. Some offered thanks. Some offered tools. Some offered awkward apologies that stumbled more than they landed. Eliza accepted what was honest and let the rest pass. Ruth Mercer did not attend. That surprised no one. Gideon did. He stood in the back all through the meeting.